A little over a year ago, I sat down and read Red Rising, the first book in the, well, go figure, Red Rising series. Now, at the time, I commented on this book. Sort of the premise of the video basically was, man, this is a controversial sci-fi read. Basically, there were a large group of people who basically said, hey, this is one of the best sci-fi series of all time. It's amazing. Everyone should read it. And there was another group who had basically the exact opposite opinion. 1 star across the board. They couldn't stand it. So I had to get to the bottom of it. How good was this book? How good was this series? I came out of that review of that first book kind of somewhere in the middle, thinking that it definitely had its pros, it definitely had its cons, but enough people came out in the comments that got me reading more. To which point I went on and read the next 2 books in the series and ended up enjoying them a whole lot more. As I think Pierce Brown sort of progressed towards the series that he wanted to write from the outset, but wasn't necessarily able, partially I think due to the climate of the time of when this book was released. Now, I completed that initial trilogy, sort of put a little check mark on it, and have gone and read a ton of other great books since. 2025 especially has been a fantastic reading year for me. But I've been getting a lot of comments on videos, and I've sort of been hankering a little bit to return back to the world of Red Rising, specifically with Iron Gold, setting up book number 4 and the start of the next part of the series. I think what was originally supposed to be a second trilogy that is now turned into more books, which is fun. And with Red God, the final book, sort of in this next arc, soon hopefully to be completed and coming to bookshelves. I definitely want to get started on reading the rest of this series. So this is going to be a full in-depth spoiler review of Iron Gold. Coming back now, time has passed, things have changed. If you have not read up until this point, yeah, this probably isn't the video for you, but why are you clicking? It's book 4 in a series. Why are you clicking on it if you haven't read it? All right, so there it is. So if you enjoy this kind of content, if you want to continue to see me discussing more about the world of Red Rising, as well as a bunch of other great sci-fi series that I'm talking about right now, maybe consider hitting that like and subscribe button down below. Now, this is going to be more of one of my longer in-depth videos. So you've probably seen the length of it if you clicked on it. So be ready to strap in on this one. I'm going to go through this, not necessarily scene by scene, but more so point by point. Off the rip, though, if folks are asking, hey, Paul, did you kind of like this one more? Yeah, I did. I was excited for a Red Rising book that was not mono POV, as I do think that was probably the single biggest thing that held back the initial trilogy a lot more. Do I wish this wasn't still written in first person? Yeah. Do I think I think this book honestly would have been like a really, really solid like 4.5 stars for me if it wasn't in first person. That is still something that is a personal bit of a gripe for me, but overall I still really enjoyed it. Now this book does, as I said, does follow some more characters, and you're going to see me checking notes a lot more through this because it's too big of a book. There's too many things going on. I got to have notes. But obviously this picks up in still the same world, 10 years after, the finishing of book number 3. And I want to say, I think this book did a phenomenal job of feeling like book 1 in a series while still also leaning on the foundation and the groundwork that was laid in the initial trilogy. And that's not an easy thing to do. This book did a good job of walking on a tightrope of sort of relying enough on some of the stuff that was initially built while still feeling like you're setting up all these plot threads and plot lines and character development really going throughout this. So of course you still have to start with Darrow, the Reaper. He's back. He's a little older, maybe not still as, maybe I wouldn't say wiser, still as hot-headed, still as stubborn. And I think it's really interesting that we sort of start this book with him being himself and also vastly hypocritical. The book basically starts, they're trying to expunge sort of the last remains of the society and sort of the inner core worlds, basically Mercury and Venus, trying to take down the last forces of the Ash Lord. The last decade has still been, basically had them embroiled in war. Like hundreds of millions of people have died, whether directly through war or through famine or other things. Like, yes, the whole idea of building up a democracy has been fantastic and been amazing, but obviously, this kind of thing isn't going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen cleanly. And basically it picks up with Darrow having just ordered an Iron Rain, going in with his vast army to sort of win back this initial, one of the planets, and basically at the cost of 1 million lives. And then you find out that he was not actually okayed to do so. In fact, the Senate, very much think back to like in the classic Roman Senate, actually denied his request for that. And basically he said, screw these politicians. They don't know what's going on. I'm the soldier. I'm the warrior in the field. I know this is the right thing to do. And Darrow putting himself above this decision and making the call himself. And in doing so, creating the significant rift and fracture, and one I think is going to continue to be a factor throughout these coming books, and one that was a factor throughout all of this. And it's interesting to me because I think this is in character for Darrow, but yeah, I think it is in character for Darrow, but it's unfortunate because as I think is going to be sort of, discovered over the course of this. And, we talked about this. I've worked in the startup world on and off for the better part of my career. And, there's an expression in that world that, the people who build the company aren't necessarily the people to lead it. You know what I mean? So like the initial people you bring in to have the great idea, how, to have the big dreams aren't necessarily, when you go public, aren't necessarily the people who sort of going to take you over the finish line and make you really profitable, make you really successful. Sometimes, maybe cooler heads prevail. And I honestly, that's kind of what this feels like. Honestly, Darrow is definitely the person to sort of get them through that initial period of turmoil and strife and, strike down the head of the society and deal with the loons and all this kind of stuff. But now in a world that could potentially be approaching peace, he's the one still screaming for war, and the whole idea of him being a warmonger I think is really interesting. Now, do I still think there's a very high likelihood that he's technically correct in this, and that yes, the Ash Lord absolutely, even though we learn later, is not necessarily in a position to want to go to war. This kind of objectively feels like a mistake, and you're left at the start of this book kind of unsure of how to root for him, because yes, Red Rising to its core, and this book is no exception, these books are an action movie. They're meant to feel badass. They're meant to have these oh shit moments, like the Reaper calls for an iron raid. Like you're meant to have those you get goosebumps and you read this, like you're meant to just sort of go in on the epicness and the over the topness of it. Like 1 million people die. Like what? Like this is, it's like the numbers, like what is this? Like a, Zhenjia, like Chinese cultivation epic and the heavens have opened and there's a, like what's going on? Like it's huge. The scale is huge. It's meant to feel massive. But at the end of the day, this idea that, Darrow fought so hard to install democracy, yet he's immediately going to just flip his nose, and stick his tongue out of the Senate and go, nah, I know better than all of you. It's a very interesting way to start the book and a very interesting way to show how this character has progressed over 10 years. Which is fun because, of course, he's only one of the first POVs that we got. Next one, of course, we get is Ephraim, who is this. I mean, I don't think you could get a more jaded person. I don't think it's possible. This sort of master thief, con man, ex-soldier, and realizing the sort of tie-ins with Holiday and the original trilogy and his fiancée or husband. And sort of those sort of familial connections and tie-ins there. And again, I love the idea of contrasting, the pinnacles of gold or red, I don't know, because Darrow very much acts and feels like a gold at this point, which is, I think, meant to be a plot point throughout this. And of course, with Lysander, to the everyman, the person who's, still down there digging in the trenches. And of course, we'll learn more of that with Lyria in a bit. But Ephraim was such an interesting character. We'll talk about just a broken person, just a fundamentally broken individual, and watching. I think he's a great example over the course of this book of a character who doesn't need to go on a big journey to go on a meaningful one, and someone who, very small decisions and small actions end up snowballing and having massive repercussions, and I think that's amazing. But even small acts of luck and how things. How a person will choose to act upon things in those moments when your true character comes through. I think just a really, really interesting and compelling character. Honestly, probably my favorite POV over the course of this book. I almost even more so than Darrow. I actually really liked Ephraim's POV in this. I think I like heist stories. I think they're great. I'm a big fan of those. I mean, someone who grew up watching, Ocean's 11 too many times. I'm a fan of those sort of classic heist stories. So reading that was fun for sure. But I think, again, just seeing the seedy underbelly of these worlds and the things that it's been alluded to in the Syndicate and all this other kind of stuff in past books, but to really see it brought to the fore, I thought was really fun. And again, it's interesting getting into the mind of such a broken character and broken in a different way, which is really cool. A character who is, I would say, like almost in so many ways the complete opposite, who is striving so hard to convince themselves that they're not broken and probably isn't in the same way. Obviously Lysander, and just from sort of seeing stuff online and sort of seeing reactions to sort of later books as well, It seems like Lysander is very much both a fan favorite and also a character that people will love to hate. And I'm really curious to see where his journey goes. I would say he probably had the least actual character development over the course of this first book. But when I say this feels like, again, book one of a series, he the most, I think, felt like this is his first book kind of character. So yeah, obviously him and Cassius are out in the asteroid belts, sort of patrolling along the rim, playing, good pirate, out, saving people from the Ascamani. I wonder if that'll play on like Romani, like travelers or that kind of stuff. I imagine it is kind of interesting. And again, sort of opening up the world building, expanding the world building a bit, sort of in the wake of the society collapsing. I thought that was very cool. And it's sort of relationship, the pseudo brother, or not even pseudo, like very much the brother relationship with him and Cassius, I thought was really interestingly developed. And this whole idea that while Lysander still loves him, he does feel like he's still outgrown him. And despite the fact that he, as a child, had idolized Darrow so much, still is of the opinion that, the society should exist and we are still golds and we should still be in charge. And it was a very interesting process to sort of watch him at the start of this book and see him go to, no, we have to save all the colors. No, we have to do all this stuff. But when push came to shove, is still not willing to sacrifice himself for that. Which, again, you can't necessarily blame him. These are strangers on a random ship that they end up sort of going in and trying to rescue. But at the same time, seeing that initial moment of more classic goodness, yet contrasting that with, no, we are still golds, we are still superior, we should still be in charge. And while he can still view the other colors as human, while he does still want to help and protect them, while he's not a fan of wanton slaughter, at the end of the day, maybe what the society was meant to be, in his still idealized version. I mean, the grandson of Lorne, I think that's, I think, again, it just makes for a very interesting and nuanced character. And I think that's every character in this. Lyria as well, I think, is a great example. I love the idea that we just got a basic red POV, like a character with no lineage, with no background, with nothing, no special, status, no, crazy physical capabilities, no, any of this other stuff. No, she's not super smart. She's not whatever. She's just a person. She's just a person. She's one of hundreds of millions or billions of reds that are scattered across the solar system. And I think in a lot of ways, she's kind of supposed to be us, the reader, in this. She's supposed to be this person in a world of, this average person in a world of gods, this mortal, thrust into this system that we see time and time again doesn't care about her until it does. And seeing her story progress through this and how she deals with these things very reactively, like so many other characters, like Darrow's story is the quintessential proactive, taking charge, following along with his journey. Every single part of it is Darrow in control, Darrow the leader, Darrow the strategist. And then there's Lyria, who's just getting dragged along behind so many of these other massive powers swirling around her. Yet the moments where she makes that choice. She chooses to save Cavex in the river. She chooses to go back and report the missing kids. How, when everything else is swirling all around you as a character, those moments where, the smallest person can change the course of the future. We can quote Lord of the Rings, the movie, albeit on this one. Yeah. And it's so fun to see that, even when someone is bashed around in this river, they're in the rapids, they're in over their head. The moments they choose to come up for their air are so critical and so essential. And so when you weave all four of these stories together, I guess this is still technically the intro of this video because we haven't even talked about the plot yet. I think you're left with something fantastic. And again, I think if this book had just not been written in first person, I would be clearly I'm singing the praises across the board. Because we are truly in space opera mode. We're not quite so aggressively grimdark. There are some moments of some slight moments of levity. But it's a dark, serious adult book that deals with all the themes. We'll go through the plot a little bit. Again, if you're here, you've read it, you've experienced it. Again, it starts with Darrow making this decision, coming back, having basically the Senate turn against him, having the Obsidians basically stop backing him, the relationship with Dancer, watching that collapse, and the idea that you can still love somebody and still fundamentally disagree with them. And the whole idea of has Darrow turned his back on what it is to be a red? Because again, if you've watched that first video of mine, I talk about from basically the beginning of the first book how I think Brown did himself a disservice from the fundamental axiom that this book series rests upon, which is just because you are more powerful doesn't mean you have the right to rule. I think he undermined that a little bit by having Darrow go through all this ridiculous process to become a gold. And there's a moment later when Lyria is talking to Mustang when she's like, oh, your husband, the gold, he's a red. He's still a red. And like the correction, like, no, he's still a red. Is he? Is he still? Because he thinks like a gold. He acts like a gold. He thinks he's better. He thinks he deserves to lead, even over his democratically elected red peers. And I imagine that is a plot point throughout this of again, what'll the descent, if you stare too long into the void will stare back into you. He who fights with monsters, like not the Lord RPG, is destined to become a monster. Like all of these themes are so clearly touched upon here, and the ending of this book is the most critical look at that. But we'll get there. Again, follows Lyria. There's an attack. I love the idea that there's sort of civil unrest even among the Reds. That after this new democracy has left them. They're fighting for scraps and the remains of Mars in this case, and the whole idea of coming out of the mines in those first moments, and the idea that those initial clans that we talked about within the Red caste society, because it's Darrow's clan, that there's another group of Reds that hate them for it. Like that would never have occurred to me as a writer to touch on and think about again. But it's absolutely true. Like there absolutely would be a group of Reds who would see Darrow as a traitor, who would hate anyone who was part of that same group as him. And I mean, wow, like what a powerful scene, like with all the children and Lyria's sister and her father. And oh my God, like you just met these characters. And I think Lyria as a character is probably shows the growth, and probably Lysander, I would say, show the growth of Brown's writing the most. There are so many small moments that make you instantly care about these characters, and that's not an easy thing to do. And I think the save the cat trope is definitely a bit true in some cases. But seeing how she saving the small piece of chocolate for her little cousin or her nephew, I guess, small moments like that tell you so much about a character. And I think that was really well done. And the whole idea that she's still, despite her destroyed arm and shoulder or whatever, still not afraid to jump in the river and try and pull out this behemoth gold who's come to save them. And the debt that is then, indebted because of the Telemanuses. And again, who doesn't love the Telemanuses? They're awesome. They're great. Didn't have a huge part in this book. I hope we see a little bit more of them as this goes on. I think they're fantastic. I mentioned it in one of my earlier reviews that they sort of feel like what gold was always meant to be. And I do hope we see more of them sort of being that shining beacon going forward as well. So that's great. And then, of course, you deal with Ephraim and setting up the heist and the sword and the realization that it was actually all just a test and a setup for some sort of bigger heist. And again, I love very much this happens multiple times over the course of this series where you're left guessing. And then was your guess right or wrong, or was it cooler? And I'm fortunate that I was very close with both of my guesses in terms of sort of the two major plot reveals in this book. Of course, the first one being that the big heist. I thought it was supposed to be stealing the Sovereign. I thought it was supposed to be going after Mustang Virginia, and I'm kind of glad that it wasn't. I actually think the development with Pax as a character, what little we saw of him in this book was awesome, and I think that ended up being a lot cooler. In the whole sort of, Ephraim, and the second you see the Red, pickpocket coming in and everything gets caught up with Lyria and you realize it's him, it's like, oh no, she's getting caught into it. Cause it was interesting too, because, you have to, when you think about big space operas, you have to obviously think about The Expanse. You have to think about, even in terms of these big epics, I have to compare it even to Game of Thrones. I think Martin, despite all the issues of the fact that we're still waiting on a last book, is one of the best authors when it comes to weaving together many disparate POVs. And the fact that we combined two of them so early, I thought was a really interesting choice, especially considering the fact that one character doesn't know. And seeing these mirrored interactions through these two different lenses when one of them is intentionally trying to, be duplicitous and sort of pulling over on the other, I thought was really neat. And then, of course, when it all sort of comes to a head and he gives the necklace, I'm like, oh, things are going to happen. Bad things are happening. And you're just sort of left, gritting your teeth watching this all unfold. And the moment when the gun jams, I thought was such a powerful one. Because I think in that moment, Ephraim would have lost it, what was left of his humanity. I think that would have been the end for him, truly. And we see him kind of claw it back towards the end of this book. But I think if that gun had gone off, that would have been, what he tried to do earlier when he tried to jump off the railing. That gun was pointed at his own head in so many ways. And the decision to not flip the safety and not do what he needed to take her with him. Again, that moment of, when so many other characters are in control, have the impetus. And again, the situation Leora just has to deal with. But again, this book is all about choices. There's been so many themes that have been wrapped throughout the various books up until this point, but the element of choice was a key one here. And of course, contrasting that to Lysander, who again is a character who's put in a position where they don't have a whole lot of autonomy over what they're trying to do. Of course, they get on the ship and discover this peerless guard, this Gold, who she's supposed to be there. How did she get here? What's going on? She's been tortured like brutally, and this is where I think even some of these descriptions, honestly, I imagine were heavily inspired. I mean, you can kind of see where some of the inspirations are. Even in one of the scenes, Lysander does this sort of this little poetic, he reads this little I guess piece of poetry, the scrap of poetry, and to me so reminiscent of the Litany Against Fear from Dune. I imagine had to have been a direct nod to that. I felt like there's nothing else that really could have been. And then sort of the same scene when they're boarding the ship, you have to get like Event Horizon kind of vibes. I also really got strong Firefly vibes from this with the Reavers, and sort of what would it actually be like to have boarded a ship that's like fully taken over by the Reavers, and what does that look like? Even though in this case they are just Obsidians, but the callousness and the cruelty was sort of taken on the same. But then the whole idea of sort of that flight and then meeting up with the Moonies, and they were one. I really briefly sort of went over a lot of their stuff in my last review in book 3, and in hindsight maybe that was a bit of an error. At the time, I didn't really appreciate just how much of a plot impact it's going to have now, and that was definitely an oversight on my part. Like, oh, he blew up the docks. Wow, tough. Moving on. I just glossed over that in that review. Probably shouldn't have, because especially now, I had a hint, I had a hunch that was what it was. There was a thing. Oh my God! As I flip my desk in perturbation or in consternation, that's the one. And. Is that going to be it? Is that big enough to blow the whole thing open? And then when you remember it in context and you realize, yeah, it probably is. Yeah, it's probably a big enough thing to have everyone go, get back into it. Again, Lysander, very interesting character. Sort of meeting, this young princess and. Young boy and all this kind of stuff, and his, he's getting played and he knows he's getting played, but hormones do be doing their thing and all this other kind of stuff. And, Seraphina, how much of it's an act and how much is he getting played? Like, you're now at this point with the Red Rising series where if you're not always expecting every character to betray you all the time forever, you're going to have a bad time. Never trust anybody, never get too invested in everybody. And that's maybe actually part of the problem. And I touched on this with sort of, the whole Roke situation and all this other kind of stuff. Like, because Brown is so consistent with his betrayals, it really makes it sometimes harder to invest in the relationships to make the betrayals hit harder. And if I had sort of any gripe with this book or what I know with this series, like everything with Apollonius and everything that's going to happen with that, like, it's going to come back to bite him in the ass. Characters are going to get betrayed. It's not going to go the way you expect. Like, so I think the bigger surprises would be the character you think is good. You're maybe on the fence about. They're like, no, I've changed. I'm going to hold my word. At this point, I think the bigger surprise would be that they do realistically, because so often I find it, I can get 70% there on like a character or relationship, but it's like, no, she's going to betray him, or no, he's going to betray him. Like, just makes it that little bit harder, but still, we follow Cassius and Lysander. They're undercover. They obviously can't tell the Moon Lords who they are. That would be ridiculous. And of course, then you realize the whole time that they actually know who they were, which makes the whole situation that much funnier. But I'm so glad we were able to discover more about this culture. Like, to me, the Moon Lords have been this sort of, again, we saw a bit of them sort of out of their context, in some of the earlier books, but I'm so happy that we are able to really see them, in terms of like on Io and all this other kind of stuff. And they have this sort of really interesting sort of austere combination of almost like Japanese sort of philosophy. I kind of got some of the vibes from that, like very minimalist, like everything is about survival. There's no waste. Like they're so far from Earth. They're so far from this additional support. And honestly, I think more than anything, this is where I see the parallels to something like The Expanse, which I thought was very neat, and talking about some of the terraforming and other stuff like that, because I am glad. One of the small things when they talked about some of the inner rim planets, like Mercury is not habitable. Like Venus is not. Venus is like absolutely uninhabitable. I love the fact that there was at least a slight nod to the pseudoscience of how they terraformed it, which involved throwing asteroids in it to knock it out of its orbit, to knock it into a further back orbit so that it's more sustainable in terms of like getting into a Goldilocks zone and like bringing in, carbon or other gases into the atmosphere and all this other kind of stuff. But just like for the record, everybody, like there's no chance we terraform these planets on the, the Mercury. That's not happening. Just for the record. But I at least like the fact that there was some nod to the terraforming elements of that from a pseudoscience perspective. And then again, out towards the outer rim with all the different moons, talking about, again, the mindset that you have to survive out there, where, a tiny sip of water is such a valuable resource. And again, feeling nods to things like Dune. I think a lot more of those sort of Herbert elements were coming through. And I love even the idea, like little things like the razors, this thought that, these massive, they're almost like an Odachi, kind of like these oversized katana vibes that they had. And even like the whole like Hasta plus Katari combo, this sort of like Daito Shoto, like, sort of Japanese style. Anyway, that's the vibes that I got. I don't know how necessarily accurate that is. We'll see if it ends up coming to live action, if that ends up holding true. But I loved how distinct the culture felt, and that they still felt like iron golds, that they still very much felt like they were weathered and tempered, and seeing folks like, Diomedes and Bellerophon and all this kind of stuff. Again, more of these great classic heroic names, though maybe not necessarily always heroic characters. And then, of course, you have the duel with Cassius and the big reveal and all this other kind of stuff, and Lysander needing to make this decision, which led us to, again, we talk about these books being action movies, the duel with Cassius and the idea of him taking down Peerless Guard after Peerless Guard, and, that epic moment, of him there in the arena, and just even, the quote, I am Cassius Obolona, son of Tiberius, son of Julia, morning knight, and my honor remains. Like, ooh, like those are the moments that give you goosebumps. You know what I mean? And I think, I hope these moments never disappear. Like, I hope this always remains a hallmark of Pierce Brown's writing, even if he decides later to move on outside of the world of Red Rising and stuff that's maybe a little bit more serious and a little less dramatic. None of those things are necessarily antithetical, but you get what I mean, because those moments are great. Like, being able to write those lines. I think Sanderson's another great example of someone who can write those really memorable lines. That's a skill. That is such a skill. And again, I just great. Like, there's such a badass moment, and then Lysander coming in and saving him, and then Cassius dying off screen. And no, you can't go see his remains. They were taken off. You've read further books in this series, you may be getting where I'm going at. If they don't die on camera, I don't believe they're dead. I'm sorry. I don't believe it for a second. Cassius may still be, maybe he's not. Maybe he is truly dead. I think it would be a little bit a disservice to the character to have him die off screen like that. I'm going to go with, I am on team, he's still alive. I think he's probably still alive. I think they're holding him as an eventual hostage or a tool to eventually use against Lysander. And I would not be surprised if he is still alive in all this. So I'm going to call that now. I'm going to put that out there now. Just going to put it out there. And then again, at this time, I'm really going off kilter in terms of plots, but here we are. Darrow and the whole breaking Apollonius out of prison. Interesting. I'm going to be honest. This is a character who I feel like I should have remembered more, apparently. He didn't really stick out to me too much from the earlier books. I don't maybe that's a me problem. So, and again, it's now been a hot minute since I've read them. It's now been over a year since I've read book one. So maybe this is partially a me problem, because they're going to the prison. They're like, we're going to break him out. It's like deep hole, deep something. And I was like, who are they breaking out? And they're like, it's this guy. And I went, oh, okay. Yeah, that guy. He's terrifying and scary, I guess. And I'm like, this is definitely a me problem. That was definitely I hadn't read the book 3 in a while before reading this. I'm going to be honest, that was definitely a bit of a fall flat moment. I'm more interested in Tongueless. I'm going to be honest, that weird obsidian who is in prison with the dog. Like, I am way more curious about that guy, to be honest. I love the fact that we just meet these sort of one-off side characters who end up sticking around and being interesting. And I don't know. I'm curious to learn more about this character. But yeah, I mean, Darrow is he's outside the law. He's running rogue. The Senate is turned on him. I would argue justifiably. The fact that he hid, the fact that he killed, or sent back ambassadors who were suing for peace. Again, he thinks it's all a trick. He thinks there's no way, it'll mess them up. And to a degree, he's right. But it's still, you know what I mean? Still, even given a potential position to sue for peace, I don't know. And I think that's Darrow's story really over this whole book is going to be, is he right? Is there a world where you can justifiably reconcile with these people who have such a fundamental disagreement on how society should function? And I think for the latter half of this series, that's going to be what it comes down to. Fundamentally, is Darrow right? Is Darrow right that the only way to get to the end, is the only way to ensure that his family is going to be safe and this new democracy can survive, is by brutally murdering every person who disagrees with you? That's the question. I think that's what it's going to come down to. Obviously, they head into the inner planets and head towards Venus and all this kind of stuff, and utilizing Apollonius's Apple. I guess everyone just calls him Apple. I've seen that on TikTok. Utilizing his brother to sort of try and get in, and of course realizing that there's not really going to be an easy way to actually get access to the Ash Lord. So they have to this whole like big epic speech, and they got to go through and like, we're going to have to go in by force, and then you do get that sort of more larger scale battle that I was kind of looking for in this book. That's the one thing. There was some smaller conflicts, but this was actually a kind of action light book, which I'm kind of a little bit surprised about. I mean, there was obviously some action, but it definitely felt a lot lighter than in maybe some of the other, maybe just even in contrast to the first Red Rising book in terms of, new book ones in this sort of scenario. We really didn't have as many moments of Darrow sort of being a force of nature, which was a little bit surprising to me. I didn't hate it. Obviously, again, he's not the only POV anymore, so he's only, theoretically a quarter of the screen time. But still, I'm glad we've, got them in their star shells and going on their mechs. I don't know why. I imagine them a little more like Gundam-esque this time in sort of the descriptions and how they're moving around. So that was kind of fun. For those who've played like PlanetSide or something, that's definitely, sort of what came to mind with all the different troops and all this kind of stuff, and the sort of different, exoskeletons and things they used. Again, technology, as always, very all over the place in Red Rising. That's still probably my single biggest gripe about the world building, is that the technology is what the plot requires it to be. So I've just stopped kind of caring. That's one of the things I think in the series that you have to just turn your brain off. You got to just kind of accept that, yeah, this is just the way it is. So, I'm not going to overly gripe about it. I thought it was still relatively solid. And then I think Brown did a pretty good job of making you care enough about the various Howlers, but didn't really kill off anybody massive. Obviously, we had some earlier character deaths, and we lost obviously some members of Ephron's crew. But I'm kind of surprised no more like major main character. I think Cassius was meant to be that, but because I don't think he's dead, it hit a little bit less. Again, maybe he is. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's just how that decision was made. But if a character doesn't die on screen, I don't believe it. So yes. Then of course, again, you have the fallout from, Lyria's escape. All these things are happening sort of in tandem. The big unveil about the Moon Lords and the fact that, They knew, that Darrow was the one that actually blew up the docks, and so they're going to go to war. Simultaneously, the children have been abducted. There's this sort of CSI crime scene moment with Holiday and Lyria. They're sort of going through and find the prints on the gun and doing all this other kind of stuff, and we believe her. And at the same time, Darrow is sort of going in and trying to set up the stakes to go invade there. So there's a lot of things happening all at the same time. I think this book did a really good job of sort of hitting these two really nice pacing arcs over the course of this, where you sort of have the middle apex climax of the book being the heist and Ephraim taking the kids, and then you sort of comes back down a bit, and then you ramp back into simultaneously getting the kids out from the Duke of Hands while simultaneously making the raid on the Ash Lord's sort of compound. And I think Brown did a really good job of balancing the pacing of these different stories and balancing the time we spent with these different characters at this point. Again, love the fact that we got some old school space battles. Love the fact that we got some espionage heist stuff. Love the fact that we got some deep political, elements of it with the Moon Lords and the coup and Dido and that ridiculously epic moment at the end with Romulus O'Ra and going out onto the barren wastes of Eye, and how many steps can he take, and this sort of like very ritualistic, again, almost felt like their version of seppuku. Again, getting a lot of inspiration from, I think, at least in my mind, from the sort of Japanese culture in that regard, and this sort of very ritualistic, honor-bound society, and again, this intractable element of these, never bent, peerless scarred, and these iron gold. Yeah. Just really cool. And then you get to the climax, and at what cost? Yes, but at what cost? All across, yes, but at what cost? And it does sort of leave on that. Did the kids in Ephraim survive? Yes, obviously they did. I imagine they did. Severo's got to go back, and then there's the decision of Darrow at the end to take off, the token from his son, those keys to that bike, and go, they don't need a father. I need to be the Reaper. Ooh, what a decision. What a and again, the fundamental backbone, I think, of this series will come down to is Darrow right? Do they need Darrow? Does Pax need a father? Or does their new fledgling democracy need the Reaper? Who's going to be right in the end? The people who call him a warmonger, his sort of tacit even betrayal of Virginia. These are the questions. And I don't know the answer yet, because the Ash Lord's, forces, some of these, they still exist, even if he doesn't necessarily. And then, of course, you've got the Moon Lords who are going to stage their invasion. The idea that, Lysander deciding not to betray, to side with Dido, to sort of push back in with Seraphina and that whole element of that faction. Man, we're going to be in for some interesting times. Let's put it that way. I'm very, very curious to see where these next few books go. Again, it's things aren't looking good. They're not quite as they're not quite as low as I think they could be in theory, but man, things aren't necessarily looking great. I'm really curious to see where Lyria is going to go as a character. I think she probably has the most open-ended story for me right now. I would love if she ends up being more of a confidant of Virginia and then that, sort of internal faction, so that we can kind of keep track on that politicking in a way that makes sense. I think that would be a really good use of her character, honestly. And then again, obviously the Howlers are split. Severo's coming back. Darrow is really, really going off on his own now. And again, it'll just come down to, is he making the right decisions? He in his mind, everyone else is crazy to trust these people and all this other kind of stuff. Yet him breaking Apollonius out of prison and kind of pseudo making him an enemy is definitely going to come back to bite him. Like, did he end up instilling a potential worse tyrant than the Ash Lord? Maybe. I love the idea that these characters will definitely make mistakes. Some of this is what's a mistake and how bad. And that's what I think, again, the whole idea of people are going to betray you, but how much and when? Like, when is the axe going to fall? When is the knife going to land? And that, to me, really, I think, is going to sum up these next few books. You're always on edge. There's very little reprieve in these books. So again, I think every single book basically has kind of gotten better. And I think this is, I would say, the best of the ones that I've read yet. Again, I don't think it was necessarily the most over the top epic. I think it definitely was one of the most balanced. but I think it was the best written. And maybe it's not necessarily my favorite, but it's definitely the best written. I thought Morningstar was really good. I really enjoyed that book. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see where this continues to go. My camera's overheated 3 times making this video because it's now so long. So I'm probably going to stop it there. But I will continue to read this as well as the Sun Eater series is another one that's up on my docket as well. As some more Joe Abercrombie. We're going to get into some of the standalones here on the channel and talk about those. So if you're a fan, again, of Red Rising, of great high fantasy, epic fantasy, lit RPG, a lot of that's still here on the channel, be sure to hit like and subscribe. And I will see you on the next one. Cheers.